They thought a parking fine would put us in our place, until the man they targeted revealed he owns every inch of the street they're standing on. The morning sun had barely risen over Maple Ridge when the silence of the quiet suburban street was broken by the sound of paper rustling in the cool autumn breeze. Ethan Hale stepped outside with his backpack slung over one shoulder, expecting nothing more than another ordinary school day. But what he saw stopped him cold. His father, Marcus, was standing perfectly still beside his dark green pickup truck, his broad shoulders tense, his weathered hands clutching a bright orange envelope taped to the windshield. The man rarely showed emotion. Decades as a civil engineer had given him the patience of stone. But in that moment, Ethan noticed something in his father's eyes he hadn't seen before, disbelief mixed with a flicker of something colder. Marcus tore the envelope from the glass and unfolded it carefully, scanning the bold, blocky letters as if hoping they would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They did not. Violation number 271, unauthorized overnight parking, $500 fine. The words looked absurd against the backdrop of their own home, the very house Marcus had built himself 20 years earlier. The truck wasn't blocking anyone's driveway, wasn't on someone else's property. It was parked directly in front of their house, on a street Marcus himself had repaved and maintained for years when the city had neglected it. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but a voice from across the street interrupted him. "Rules are rules, Marcus," called Leonard Crane, leaning back lazily in a white porch chair, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his manicured hands. His gray hair was slicked back as usual, and his expensive robe looked out of place among the modest brick homes of Maple Ridge. But Leonard thrived on standing out. He wasn't just any neighbor. He was the president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, and in his mind, that made him the most powerful man on the block. Marcus didn't look at him. He folded the notice once, twice, 3 times, each crease deliberate and controlled, then tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Come on, Dad," Ethan said quietly. "You're not just going to let him get away with that, are you?" His father didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the space where his truck had been parked as if measuring every inch of asphalt with his mind. "Get in the car, son," Marcus said finally, his voice calm, too calm. "You'll be late for school." As they drove down the street, Ethan glanced at Leonard through the passenger side window. The man was still sitting there, sipping his coffee with a smug little smile, like a king surveying his kingdom. It wasn't the first time Leonard had fined someone for a ridiculous reason. He was notorious for it. Citations for leaving a trash can out an hour too long, penalties for a lawn growing half an inch too high, warnings for mailboxes being inconsistent with the neighborhood's visual harmony. Most residents grumbled and paid because fighting back meant court fees, threats, and months of harassment. Leonard counted on that, but Marcus Hale was not most residents. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Ethan, but he couldn't stop replaying the morning in his mind. When he got home that afternoon, he found his father in the garage, not fuming as Ethan expected, but working quietly at his old drafting table. Dozens of papers were spread before him, maps, surveys, property records. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked. Marcus looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Just reviewing some old documents," he said. "You know, back when this neighborhood was still being built." He held up a faded blueprint of Maple Ridge from decades earlier. "Funny thing, Ethan. Most people don't read the fine print on development agreements, but I do." Ethan stepped closer and frowned at the map. It showed their street highlighted in blue, and next to it, in neat typed letters, was something he'd never noticed before. "Private easement retained by original landholder." "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," Marcus said, folding the blueprint carefully, "Leonard Crane has a lot less power than he thinks he does." The next morning, a small crowd had gathered near the Hale home. Leonard was strutting around in his usual self-satisfied manner, clipboard in hand, pointing out supposed violations on neighboring houses. "Too many lawn ornaments," he muttered, scribbling something down. "Improper mailbox height. Paint shade unauthorized." A few men standing nearby sighed but said nothing. That was the effect Leonard had. He thrived on intimidation, and his neighbor's silence was his favorite weapon. But this time, Marcus didn't look intimidated. He stood beside his truck, arms crossed, watching Leonard's little parade with the quiet patience of someone watching a storm gather from a distance. Ethan noticed how different his father seemed now, not angry, but calculating. Every time Leonard looked their way, Marcus's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. Leonard sauntered over at last, pen poised like a judge's gavel. "Marcus," he said, feigning surprise, "I see you haven't moved that vehicle yet. You're already 1 day past the compliance period. I could have it towed, you know." "You could," Marcus said evenly, "but you won't." Leonard's eyes narrowed. "And why's that?" "Because," Marcus replied, leaning in just enough for only Leonard to hear, "you might be trespassing." For the first time, Leonard's confident facade faltered. "Trespassing?" he scoffed, recovering quickly. "This is HOA jurisdiction." Marcus didn't respond. He simply walked back to his garage, leaving Leonard standing there with his clipboard dangling uselessly in his hand. Ethan watched his father disappear into the dim interior, that same faded blueprint still pinned to the drafting table inside. That night, long after Ethan had gone to bed, Marcus sat alone under the dim garage light, flipping through a thick folder of legal documents. He paused on one, a deed with his signature on it. It was dated nearly 2 decades ago, and at the bottom, in legal language most people would ignore, were the words, "Full ownership of Maple Ridge Lane and all associated easements." Marcus closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curling upward. Leonard Crane had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground he was standing on, and in his arrogance, Leonard had no idea what storm was about to descend upon him. Leonard thought he was dealing with another passive homeowner too afraid to fight back. He had no idea that the man he'd just fined was the legal owner of the very street beneath his feet. And he was about to learn that lesson the hardest way imaginable. The morning after the orange envelope appeared on Marcus Hale's windshield, Maple Ridge was already buzzing with tension. Word spread quickly in the tight-knit neighborhood, and by noon, most residents knew that Leonard Crane, the HOA president, had fined Marcus for parking in front of his own home. It wasn't the first time Leonard had pulled a stunt like this, but something about this particular citation felt different, bolder, more calculated, as if Leonard wanted to make an example of Marcus. And in truth, he did. Leonard Crane had ruled Maple Ridge not like a community leader, but like a monarch with absolute power. Nearly 10 years earlier, he'd been just another resident, polite, soft-spoken, offering to help with landscaping and block parties. But once he was elected HOA president, something changed. The polite neighbor vanished, replaced by a man who believed the bylaws were his personal weapon and the neighborhood his private fiefdom. He began patrolling the streets twice a day, rain or shine, clipboard in one hand, camera in the other. He'd crouch behind hedges to photograph garden hoses left out too long, measure grass blades with a ruler to issue fines for being overgrowth, and even peek through windows to note unsightly curtains. Every week he hosted HOA meetings in the community hall, transforming them into public tribunals. He would single out homeowners by name, projecting photos of their supposed violations onto a screen as if they were criminals on trial. "We must uphold the integrity of Maple Ridge," he would declare, his voice booming with self-importance. "One person's negligence lowers everyone's property value." And though residents left those meetings humiliated and angry, most still paid their fines. Leonard had them convinced that resistance would only bring more trouble. Leonard thrived on that fear. It was his fuel, his proof that his authority was absolute. And when Marcus Hale didn't immediately move his truck or respond to the citation, Leonard's irritation grew. He saw Marcus's silence not as confidence, but as defiance, and Leonard could not tolerate defiance. By the end of that week, Marcus's mailbox held 2 more notices. One accused him of excessive trash can exposure, citing a single bin left at the curb 30 minutes after pickup. Another cited unauthorized vehicle storage, referring to Marcus's pickup, still parked where it had always been. Leonard even sent a formal letter warning that the truck could be towed at Marcus's expense. "Your continued disregard for HOA regulations will not be tolerated," the letter read, signed in Leonard's looping handwriting. "Failure to comply will result in further action." Ethan found the letter before his father did and stormed into the living room. "This is ridiculous. He's obsessed, Dad. Are you just going to let him do this? Marcus glanced at the paper and smiled faintly. Patience, Ethan, he said, folding it neatly and placing it on the table with the others. When people push too hard, they reveal more than they intend. Meanwhile, Leonard's behavior toward the rest of the neighborhood was becoming even more unhinged. One afternoon, Ethan watched from the window as Leonard stopped outside their neighbor Daniel Brooks's house, snapping photos of a basketball hoop in the driveway. Violation, Leonard muttered to himself, jotting something down. Daniel came out moments later, frustration etched across his face. Leonard, my son plays here every day, Daniel protested. It's not bothering anyone. Regulations are regulations, Leonard replied coldly. Driveways are not recreational spaces. You'll receive a notice, Daniel shook his head. This is going too far. Too far? Leonard's lips curled into a smirk. If you think this is too far, you might want to read Section 12B again. Encounters like that had become common. Leonard wielded the HOA handbook like a sword, cutting down anyone who questioned him. Yet despite growing resentment, no one dared challenge him. Most believed Leonard had the law on his side, that his power was untouchable. But Marcus's silence unsettled Leonard more than he admitted. Other homeowners yelled, complained, even threatened lawsuits, all of which Leonard relished because they meant he was in control. But Marcus? Marcus did none of that. He accepted each citation without argument, even thanking Leonard politely when they crossed paths. The calm unnerved him. It made him wonder if Marcus knew something he didn't. One evening, Leonard caught sight of Marcus on his porch, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the trees. You're still ignoring the violations, Leonard called out, walking across the street with his usual swagger. Marcus looked up and smiled. No, Leonard. I'm not ignoring them. I'm acknowledging them. Leonard frowned. Then why haven't you complied? Marcus's gaze shifted briefly to the road beneath their feet before returning to Leonard's face. Because sometimes, Leonard, it's important to know where the lines are drawn, and who drew them. Leonard blinked, unsure how to respond. There was something in Marcus's tone, a quiet confidence that unsettled him, but he brushed it off quickly. You can talk in riddles all you like, he snapped, turning on his heel. The HOA has rules, and they apply to everyone. As Leonard walked away, Ethan stepped out onto the porch. What did you mean by that? He asked his father. Nothing, Marcus replied with a slight smile. Just reminding him that even kings have borders. Despite his bravado, Leonard was beginning to feel the pressure. Rumors were spreading. Whispers among the neighbors about the legality of certain fines, about Leonard using HOA funds for personal landscaping projects, about deals made behind closed doors. Leonard dismissed them as gossip, but the unease gnawed at him. And still, Marcus remained silent, watching, waiting. By the end of the second week, Leonard had convinced himself that Marcus was bluffing. He'll crack, he told himself as he typed up yet another violation notice. They all do eventually. He pinned the notice to Marcus's door himself, stepping back to admire his work. From across the street, he saw Marcus glance at it, fold it neatly, and walk back inside without a word. It infuriated Leonard, but it also blinded him. He was so focused on breaking Marcus that he failed to see the trap slowly being laid around him. Every notice he issued, every threat he made, every arrogant step he took was a piece of evidence building against him. And with each passing day, Marcus's silence grew heavier, more deliberate. Leonard strutted around like an untouchable emperor, convinced that Marcus, like everyone else, would eventually bend the knee. But Marcus never once argued or protested. He simply smiled politely, thanked Leonard for the notices, and continued about his day, all while setting the stage for a reckoning Leonard could never see coming. The night Leonard decided to cross the line was moonless and still, the kind of darkness that swallows sound. A damp wind hissed through the trees lining Maple Ridge, rattling dried leaves against streetlights. Most of the neighborhood slept, unaware that a quiet act of war was unfolding right under their noses. Down the street, a tow truck rolled in with its lights off, creeping toward the curb in front of Marcus's house like a predator closing in on prey. The driver stepped out, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid to be seen. Leonard stood a few paces behind him, arms crossed, lips curled into a smug half-smile. That's the one. he whispered, nodding toward the faded blue pickup parked neatly by the curb. "Take it. Don't worry, I'll handle the fallout." Metal groaned as the tow hook clamped onto the rear axle. Tires squealed softly as the truck was hauled away into the night. Leonard watched until the last taillight vanished around the corner, then shoved his hands in his pockets and strolled home, humming under his breath. He had finally done it, he thought. Finally shown Marcus that Maple Ridge was his to command. Morning came with the pale gold light of early autumn, but for Marcus it began with confusion. As he stepped out onto the porch with his mug of coffee, a faint chill ran through him. The curb in front of his house was empty. His truck, the one he drove to work, the one he had parked there every day for years, was gone. All that remained was a jagged scrape in the asphalt, a raw gouge where metal had bitten into the pavement. "Dad," his son called from the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Where's the truck?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He walked down the steps slowly, crouching by the scar on the road, fingers tracing its edge. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't a prank. Someone had towed his vehicle from in front of his own home. And then, as if summoned by Marcus's rising anger, Leonard appeared at the end of the driveway. He strutted down the sidewalk with his usual arrogant posture, HOA badge gleaming in the morning sun. "Good morning," he said, voice thick with satisfaction. "Seems like someone finally decided to enforce the parking rules?" Marcus straightened and faced him, calm but cold. "You had my truck towed." Leonard shrugged, feigning innocence. "I didn't do anything." The HOA simply requested that vehicles violating our community guidelines be removed. Maybe now you'll learn to follow the rules. A silence hung between them, stretched taut as a wire. Behind Marcus's steady gaze, something shifted, not anger, not outrage, but something sharper, calculating. "Is that so?" Marcus asked softly. "Of course," Leonard said, his smirk widening. "We're just keeping the neighborhood tidy." It was then, in that exact moment, that Leonard unknowingly handed Marcus the weapon that would destroy him. Because the space where the truck had been parked, the public street Leonard believed the HOA governed, wasn't public at all. It never had been. Years earlier, when Maple Ridge was first built, the development company had gone bankrupt before completing the transfer of ownership for several roads. Those parcels of land had remained in limbo until Marcus, then a rising civil engineer with a sharp eye for detail, quietly acquired them when he purchased his property. The HOA, desperate to organize quickly, had never checked the fine print. Leonard had built his little kingdom on a legal illusion. And now, by towing a vehicle from land he didn't own, Leonard had done more than overstep his authority. He had committed multiple crimes, trespassing, theft, and property damage all at once. Marcus said nothing about this revelation. He only offered a small, knowing nod. "Thank you for clarifying," he said, then turned and walked back inside, leaving Leonard frowning at his back. But Marcus's silence wasn't surrender. It was the stillness before a storm. That evening, the driveway light burned late into the night. Inside his study, Marcus spread out old land deeds and plat maps across the desk, tracing faded boundary lines with a steady hand. He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a file, HOA notices, fines, threatening letters, each one carefully dated and labeled. At the back, he slipped in a new document, the police report for his stolen truck. From that day forward, everything changed. Marcus stopped responding to Leonard's petty provocations. He stopped arguing at meetings and ignored the endless letters that arrived in his mailbox. Instead, he observed, he documented. He photographed every time Leonard trespassed onto his property, every instance where HOA contractors set foot on land they did not own. He logged the serial number of the tow truck, the name of the company, and the time of the incident. Weeks passed, and Leonard mistook Marcus's silence for defeat. He grew bolder, issuing new citations, hinting that Marcus's fence was too tall, even suggesting that his mailbox violated community aesthetics. Each move, each insult, Marcus added to his growing arsenal, and then something unexpected happened. One crisp afternoon, a city inspector stopped by Maple Ridge to assess a nearby drainage issue. As he reviewed property lines with Marcus, his eyes widened. "You're aware this road isn't part of the city grid, right?" he asked, puzzled. "According to our records, this entire stretch, from Maple Bend Lane to Willow Circle, is privately owned, and it's registered under your name." Marcus gave a small, tight smile. "Yes," he said. "I'm aware." The inspector scribbled a note, clearly intrigued. "Well, that changes a few things." Word of the visit spread faster than Marcus expected. Within days, whispers rippled through the neighborhood. Was it true the street wasn't public? Did the HOA even have authority here? Leonard brushed off the rumors as nonsense, but there was a flicker of doubt now, a crack in the certainty he had built his power on. One evening, as Marcus stood on his porch watching the sunset stain the sky orange and gold, Leonard stormed across the lawn, red-faced and furious. "Are you spreading lies about the road?" he demanded. "Because if you're trying to undermine the HOA, I will—" "You will what?" Marcus interrupted calmly. "Trespass again? Tow another vehicle from land you don't own?" Leonard faltered. "That's ridiculous." "This is a public road." Marcus turned and disappeared inside without another word. A few seconds later, he returned holding a weathered folder. He opened it and laid a single document on the porch railing. The original deed, signed and sealed, proving his ownership of the street. Leonard stared at it, his jaw tightening as the color drained from his face. "This isn't over," he hissed, snatching the paper and shoving it back toward Marcus. "You think you're clever, but the HOA has lawyers. Real lawyers." Marcus met his glare without flinching. "Then I suggest you hire them," he said quietly, "because you just made this a legal matter." Leonard turned and stormed away, but his footsteps lacked the confidence they once had. Something fundamental had shifted. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. Inside, Marcus closed the folder and placed it gently back in the drawer, atop the growing mountain of evidence. His anger had cooled now, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. This wasn't about a parking space anymore. It was about principle, about arrogance that had gone unchecked for too long. Leonard thought he had humiliated Marcus. Instead, he had handed him the perfect weapon. From that day forward, every arrogant move Leonard made was documented, every threatening letter filed away. Marcus wasn't angry anymore. He was preparing for war. The first frost of the season glittered across the lawns of Maple Ridge when Marcus began the next phase of his plan. The air was sharp and cold, but his mind was sharper still, a relentless machine turning every slight, every humiliation Leonard had dealt him into ammunition. He rose earlier than usual that morning, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and laid out a stack of papers on his dining table. Deeds, plats, municipal filings. Each document told a part of the story Leonard had ignored. And together they painted a picture the HOA president could never explain away. Marcus studied each page with an engineer's precision, the property deed showing he owned Maple Bend Lane outright. The original development agreement revealing the city had never accepted the street into public maintenance. The surveyor's map proving the HOA's boundary ended nearly 30 feet before Leonard believed it did. He even unearthed an old letter from the planning department confirming the land's private status, a letter Leonard had never bothered to request before flexing his authority. But documents alone would not be enough. Leonard was arrogant, but he wasn't entirely careless. If Marcus wanted to crush the HOA's grip for good, he needed proof of more than ignorance. He needed evidence of intent. So he turned his house into a fortress of observation. Discreet cameras appeared along the property line, tucked beneath eaves and mounted on fence posts. One watched over the curb where his truck had been taken. Another tracked the alley where Leonard liked to stroll at night, clipboard in hand, peering at driveways he had no right to inspect. Over the next several weeks, Marcus collected hours of footage. Leonard stepping over clearly marked boundaries, measuring yards that weren't under his jurisdiction, and even photographing license plates, all without a shred of legal authority. Each clip was labeled, dated, and backed up on encrypted drives. Marcus watched them late into the night, his jaw tightening as he replayed Leonard's smug expressions. "That's another one," he muttered to himself each time Leonard crossed the line. The tow truck incident was next on his list. Marcus called the towing company one afternoon, his tone polite but firm. "I'm the owner of the property from which a vehicle was recently removed," he said. "I need a copy of the work order for my records." The dispatcher hesitated but complied. When the email arrived, Marcus opened it and stared at the scanned form. There it was, Leonard's signature, bold and unmistakable, authorizing the removal of a vehicle from land he didn't own. The work order even listed the location as public street adjacent to Maple Ridge HOA, a phrase that was now demonstrably false. Marcus printed the document and slipped it into a thick binder marked evidence. Phase 1. But Marcus's strategy didn't stop with his own case. He began reaching out quietly to others who had suffered under Leonard's rule. It started with Mr. Patterson down the street, who had been fined $300 for leaving his garbage cans out an hour too long. Then came Harold Green, a retired teacher threatened with a lien over a flower bed too close to the sidewalk, and James Taylor, whose fence had been deemed non-compliant, even though it matched the HOA's own specifications. Each man arrived at Marcus's kitchen table with a folder of letters, fines, and angry memories. Marcus listened to their stories in silence, jotting notes and asking careful questions. Did they ever provide proof of the violation? Was the board vote documented? Did anyone notify you of an appeal process? Again and again, the answers revealed a pattern: sloppy enforcement, selective targeting, and blatant misuse of power. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said one night as the men gathered around his table, the binder growing thicker with every contribution. "It's about all of us. They think they can do whatever they want because no one will challenge them. It's time we change that." A quiet determination settled over the group. What had begun as isolated frustrations was now something larger, a coalition, united by purpose and fueled by years of resentment. Together, they uncovered even more damning evidence: budget reports that didn't add up, landscaping contracts awarded to Leonard's cousin without bids, and emails where Leonard openly mocked residents he fined. The binder that had once held a handful of documents now bulged with hundreds of pages. Marcus paid a notary to certify the most critical pieces and even hired a surveyor to provide an expert statement verifying his ownership of the disputed road. Every possible angle was considered. Every loophole was closed. And yet, through it all, Marcus remained outwardly unchanged. He still waved politely when Leonard passed by. He still trimmed his hedges and attended HOA meetings. Even when Leonard bragged loudly about teaching that stubborn man a lesson, Marcus only smiled faintly and nodded. At the next board meeting, he arrived 10 minutes early, binder in hand, and took a seat near the front. Leonard stood at the podium, chest puffed out, lecturing the room about order, discipline, and the importance of compliance. His voice dripped with condescension. "I know some people here think they're above the rules," Leonard sneered, glancing deliberately at Marcus. "But this community thrives on respect. Without it, everything falls apart." Marcus raised his hand politely. "I just want to understand the rules better," he said, his tone mild and unthreatening. "I'd hate to violate them by mistake." Leonard's smirk widened. "I'm glad you're finally seeing reason." The room chuckled, and Leonard moved on with his speech, oblivious to the trap coiling around him. He didn't see the binder resting on Marcus's lap, or the silent cameras capturing every word he spoke. He didn't know that the towing company's work order with his signature now sat in a sealed envelope addressed to the county prosecutor. And he certainly didn't realize that several of the men sitting quietly in the back row were preparing affidavits of their own. The board meeting ended without incident, Leonard shaking hands and boasting about the new fine schedule he planned to introduce. Marcus thanked him for his time, shook his hand, and walked out into the crisp night with the faintest hint of a smile. Because the truth was, the game was already over. Leonard just didn't know it yet. The evidence was airtight. The witnesses were ready. The law was on Marcus's side. And the man who thought he ruled Maple Ridge was walking straight into a reckoning he could neither avoid nor stop. If Leonard sensed anything unusual, he didn't show it. He was too busy planning his next crackdown to realize the trap he was walking into, one that would spring shut in front of the entire neighborhood. The evening of the quarterly HOA meeting arrived beneath a sky heavy with rain clouds, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. For nearly a decade, Leonard Crane had treated this gathering like a coronation, striding into the Maple Ridge Community Hall with the self-importance of a king returning to his throne. Tonight, though, something felt different. The usual chatter of small talk was laced with tension, with curious glances darting toward the man seated quietly near the front. Marcus Hale, a slim leather portfolio resting on his lap, a manila folder at his feet, and a calm, unreadable expression on his face. Leonard swept into the room 5 minutes late, as always, soaking in the attention. "Good evening, neighbors," he boomed, his voice carrying through the small hall. "I see a lot of familiar faces here tonight, as well as a few who could stand to mow their lawns." Laughter rippled from a few of his loyal supporters, but most in the crowd remained silent. Leonard barely noticed. He was too busy basking in his own authority. The meeting began predictably. Updates on landscaping schedules, talk of repainting the clubhouse, and a lengthy rant about recent violations and chronic offenders. Leonard paced back and forth before the podium like a judge preparing to sentence the guilty. "We cannot allow disorder to creep into our community," he declared. "Rules exist for a reason, and those who ignore them will face the consequences." Marcus rose quietly from his seat. "Before we go further," he said, his voice calm but firm, "there's something everyone here needs to see." The room turned toward him. Leonard's confident stride faltered slightly. "Marcus," he said with a condescending smile, "if this is about your truck again—" "It's about more than that," Marcus interrupted. He stepped forward and laid a stack of crisp documents on the long table at the front. "This," he continued, "is the property deed to Maple Bend Lane. The street you've been issuing fines on, the street you had my truck towed from, the street you claim belongs to the HOA. He paused and looked Leonard dead in the eye. "It's mine." A silence fell so heavy it was almost physical. Then came the murmurs, confused at first, then rising like a tide. Leonard blinked, his face pale and rigid. That's impossible," he stammered, rifling through the papers with trembling hands. There must be some mistake." "There isn't," Marcus replied evenly. "The developer never transferred the road to the city. And I bought the land before this HOA even existed. It's been in my name for over 20 years. Leonard's jaw worked silently. "Even if that's true, you can't just—" But Marcus wasn't finished. He lifted a remote from his pocket and clicked it. A screen at the front of the hall flickered to life, displaying crisp video footage. Leonard, flashlight in hand, stepping over Marcus's property line at midnight. Leonard, measuring vehicles and photographing license plates. Leonard, pointing at Marcus's truck as the tow hook latched on, all of it captured in high definition. "This is you," Marcus said quietly. "Trespassing, illegally authorizing a tow, damaging private property." Leonard's composure began to crack. "This is outrageous," he barked. "You have no right to—" "Actually," another voice interrupted, deeper and steadier. A tall man in a gray suit rose from the back of the room and stepped forward. "I'm Thomas Reeves, counsel for Mr. Hale, and I'm here to inform this board that a lawsuit has already been filed for theft, trespassing, property damage, and fraud." Several residents have joined as co-plaintiffs. A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. Leonard's supporters shifted uneasily in their seats. Others, long silent under his rule, exchanged looks of vindication. "This is absurd," Leonard hissed, sweat beading on his temple. "You think some lawsuit is going to scare me?" "It's not just the lawsuit," Marcus replied, and placed another document on the table, a ledger, its pages marked with highlighted transactions. "This is a record of HOA funds being spent on personal expenses, vacations, home renovations, even a payment to a company owned by your brother-in-law. All traced back to your signature whispers turned into shouts now." "Is that true?" someone yelled. "We paid for that?" another demanded. Leonard's voice was drowned in the uproar. "You don't understand," Leonard sputtered, his voice cracking. "It's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," Marcus said quietly, "and the authorities will see it too." The meeting spiraled into chaos. Residents crowded the front, shouting questions and accusations. A few demanded Leonard's resignation on the spot. Others wanted refunds, audits, explanations. Leonard backed toward the podium as if cornered, his confidence gone. "I am the president of this HOA," he shouted desperately. "You can't just—" But his words were met with a voice colder than any winter wind. "Not anymore." It was one of the board members, an older man who had remained loyal until now. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. Leonard's face drained of color. He looked out over the crowd, a sea of faces that had once feared him, now glaring with righteous anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. He simply turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence that followed. The aftermath unfolded swiftly. Within weeks, investigators confirmed Marcus's claims. Leonard was arrested on charges of embezzlement and misuse of funds. The lawsuit against him moved forward, bolstered by witness testimony and an unassailable mountain of evidence. The HOA, stripped of credibility and bankrupt from legal fees, voted to dissolve itself entirely. In its place, the residents formed a voluntary neighborhood council, transparent, cooperative, and free from the tyranny they had endured. And Marcus? He returned to the quiet life he had always wanted. One crisp morning, neighbors watched as he stood by the curb overseeing a crew repainting the old tow zone. When they were done, a brand new sign gleamed under the autumn sun: private property. Parking welcome. Marcus smiled faintly as he ran his hand over the cool metal. The man Leonard thought he could bully now owned the ground beneath his feet, and justice had never felt so poetic. The man Leonard thought he could bully now owned the ground beneath his feet, and justice had never felt so poetic. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of community authority, the misuse of bureaucratic power, and the severe consequences of vigilantism. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of dignity and accountability, showing that petty control can lead to unexpected and instant financial repercussions.